When on backpacking adventures, having a quality sleeping pad is the #1 way you can ensure that you have a warm and comfortable sleep. But with top-end sleeping pads costing well over $200 these days, I want to test these 5 budget sleeping pads and ask the question, can a sleeping pad be warm and comfortable while costing under $100? And do I think any of these pads could be a better option than their expensive rivals? The test will involve laying on all 5 pads to assess comfort and warmth. Pads have been inflated to about 90% of their full capacity, and I'll be using a 20-degree Fahrenheit down quilt as top insulation and Alpha Direct base layers. I will lay on each pad for 30 minutes, which is how long I have found is necessary for a pad to warm up at freezing temperatures. I will then try side and back positions to assess comfort, but mostly lay on my back for assessing warmth. After testing each pad, I will take the top 2 that are warm enough for the conditions, but also the most comfortable, and do an overnight side-by-side comparison to crown a budget pad winner. Temperatures right now are 10 degrees Celsius, and overnight lows are expected to get down to freezing. I'm in the desert, and the sun has been heating up the ground all day, so as I'm testing, air temperature will be much more of a factor, but as I get into the later parts of the night, ground temperature will also start to factor in.
Like I mentioned, I'll be testing 5 pads. The Flextail R5 that costs $140, weighs 727 grams, and has an R value of 5.6. It is 2.7 inches thick and has vertical baffles. The Nature Hike R5 costs $70, weighs 594 grams, and has the highest R value at 5.8. It is 3.15 inches thick and has dimpled baffles. The One Tigris Obsidian costs $80, is the heaviest pad at 812 grams, and has an R value of 5.2. It is also 3.15 inches thick and has dimpled baffles. The Decathlon MT500 Insulated is the cheapest pad at $60, weighs 644 grams, and has an R value of 3.3, which is the lowest of the bunch. It is 2 inches thick, which is the thinnest of all the pads, and has vertical baffles. The Kilo Skier AeroCloud Ultralight costs $113, is the lightest at 487 grams, and has an R value of 3.8. It's also the thickest pad at 4 inches thick and uses dimpled baffles.
Good morning. That was an interesting night, but we'll get into that. Let's start off by talking about how my testing went with each of these pads, starting with the Flextail. From a comfort standpoint, it was very comfortable. It wasn't the most comfortable out of all the pads that I tested, but it was definitely up there. I really like vertical baffles these days. I find that especially if you're a side sleeper, vertical baffles are pretty good for pressure relief. Not quite as good if you're a back sleeper, but still pretty comfortable. It was also surprisingly warm, even though it doesn't have any insulation in the 2 side baffles, until I started getting down into really low temperatures. Especially when temperatures started approaching freezing, I really started to feel the cold through the Flextail. For the Decathlon, comfort was pretty good for what it is. It also uses vertical baffles, but is significantly thinner than the Flextail, and you can really feel that thinness when you're shifting positions from your side to your back or sitting up on it. I am 180 pounds, 5'10", and I was definitely bottoming out on the Decathlon pad. Even outside of the thickness, the vertical baffles aren't quite as comfortable as on the Flextail because the material is just really kind of gritty and quite stiff. It's not as soft and flexible as it is on the Flextail. For warmth, it's not a warm pad. It has an R value of 3.3, but I definitely started feeling the cold around the 10-degree mark, which is not very cold. The reason it's so cold is because it uses a heat press system in order to create the baffles, which leads to a lot of really thin areas on the pad that is great for heat loss. You get pretty cold in those spots from this pad. A pad that wasn't cold was the Nature Hike pad. As soon as I laid on this pad, I started feeling the heat reflected back to me because it uses suspended Mylar film throughout the pad. And I was toasty warm. I'll say it right now, this was the warmest pad out of the 5 by quite a large margin. For comfort, it's kind of so-so. It does use a dimpled baffling system, which I find the most comfortable baffling system because each of those little raised areas acts as an air spring and is really good for pressure relief. With the Nature Hike pad, those little air springs are really tiny and they don't have a lot of kind of travel to them. So it's not as good as some other pads that use that dimpled baffle technology, but still pretty good. The other aspect is thickness. This pad is going to be too thin for some people out there. You're going to bottom out when you're laying on your side or as you're shifting positions, which isn't the case with the other pad, the One Tigris, which also uses a dimpled baffling system. The One Tigris was the most comfortable pad that I used. It has that dimpled baffling system. It's quite thick, and I had great pressure relief when I was laying on my side. It was comfortable when I was laying on my back. It was definitely the most comfortable pad that I used. For warmth, it started off really good at about 10 degrees Celsius. I was toasty warm on the One Tigris. And then as the temperature kind of dropped towards that freezing level, the overnight low was -1 degree Celsius. I started feeling the cold through it. And that was a little disappointing. I was hoping that I was going to be able to get down to below freezing and be fine on the One Tigris. The Kilos Gear pad, on the other hand, started off cold right off the bat. I never even got close to being warm on this pad, and that's because it doesn't use any insulation. There's no insulation in this pad, so obviously you're gonna be cold unless you're in very warm temperatures. For comfort, it's about on par with Nature Hike, but for different reasons. The pressure relief isn't quite as good, but the thickness is quite a bit larger, so you're gonna have that trade-off between these two pads. So the interesting aspect of my testing last night was I got through testing all of the pads. I laid on them for at least half an hour each, on my side, on my back, and it was great. I picked my top two pads, which were the Flextail and the One Tigris, but then the wind picked up and it started really buffeting my tent. So I checked the weather and the forecast called for over 100 km/h gusts and 80 km sustained winds overnight. So I packed up all of my gear, packed up my tent, and then I slept in my car, my rental car, overnight. Luckily I got a big SUV, so I was still able to fully lay out both the One Tigris and Flextail pads and get a true test on them. And by leaving the windows open, I was still able to continue my testing as to how warm these pads were. So after my testing, do I think either of these pads deserve the crown of the top budget pad out of the 5 that I tested on this trip? And the answer is kind of a maybe. After my testing overnight, I'd probably bump the Flextail down to being below the Nature Hike. I'd bump the Nature Hike up in that number 2 position just because of how warm it is relative to all the other pads. For the One Tigris, I'm on the fence. And the reason for that is the weight. It's not a light pad, but you have that comfort factor rolled into it. It's a very comfortable pad. That I proved that overnight by sleeping on it quite a bit. But the problem is the warmth. For how heavy it is, I would expect it to be warm down below freezing. So because of that, I don't think I can crown the One Tigris or any of these pads. Each of these pads had some sort of compromise, whether that's weight or comfort or warmth, and that's really to be expected with budget pads. You have compromises even with those pads that cost over $200. So with these budget pads, it's not a surprise that there's compromises that are happening. That being said, there are a couple options I think would be worth taking a look at if you are looking at a more affordable pad, and that would be the One Tigris pad and the Nature Hike pad. I'm still very intrigued by the Nature Hike pad, especially because it is one of the least expensive pads that we looked at, but has that really high warmth and then a pretty good comfort level. So I'm gonna take it out on a trip and do a little bit more testing with it. That's what these group testing kind of adventures are all about, is really kind of sifting through some of the not so great options and then being able to really pick what I want to test more fully out of the options that are a little bit better. If you're curious about 3 winter rated budget sleeping pad options, go check out this video right up here. I test the Nature Hike 8.8, the Light Tour 7.5, and the Hike Enter 6.2. They're all very affordable pads that are R-value rated to winter conditions, but I put that to the test on this trip.